The ninth iteration of the Inspiring Philosophy podcast for supporters. This is a special Q&A podcast that we do where Michael Jones answers questions submitted by supporters. If you want to have your questions answered by Michael Jones on this podcast, make sure to become a supporter today. All right, how are you feeling today, Michael?
Good. How about yourself?
Doing all right. I'm looking forward to hearing your answers to these questions. So let's get right into them. First one is from Eric Hansen from Patreon. Eric asks, many Muslims have claimed that Christianity didn't start with Christ, but with Paul. What would be the quickest way to disprove this?
It's just a silly argument. For one thing, it's very easy to point out that Paul wasn't just making things up. You can claim that maybe it's possible he was here or there, because that's what Muslims want to say. But Paul quotes earlier sources, creeds, hymns. So Philippians 2 is an early hymn, and it has a very high Christology. It refers to Jesus as being God. It uses Old Testament passages about Yahweh and applies them to Jesus. Scholars are the consensus of scholars is pretty much on board that this did not originate from Paul. This was something that he inherited from the early church. Another one is 1 Corinthians 15, which is a creed. Paul opens it by saying, "For I delivered to you what I received." And then he says, Christ died, was buried, and resurrected. Now, most Sunni Muslims deny that Jesus was even crucified. Yet, Paul is citing an early creed that he inherited that says Jesus was crucified, died, buried, and resurrected. And the majority of scholars I've seen date this creed to within 3 years of Pentecost. So it's a very, very early creed, and it directly contradicts one of the main beliefs in traditional Sunni Islam. So right then and there, we can see Paul was not inventing these doctrines. He's clearly inheriting these from the early church. They'll try to quote someone like James Tabor, who argues that Paul invented Christianity, but they don't actually read him, because he's not saying that Paul invented every doctrine of Christianity. He's claiming that Paul invented certain doctrines, like saved by grace through faith, that he is taking Old Testament passages and reinterpreting them to fit his new theology. Tabor is not saying that Paul invented the crucifixion, the resurrection belief. He's saying that Paul has like an expanded theology, and he's been challenged on that, and not all scholars agree with him. For example, you look at Seun Kim's chapter in Dictionary of Paul and His Letters. He notes Paul over and over again is getting theology that we find in the Gospels. It's very similar. And there's very little evidence that the Gospel authors were copying Paul, because if they did, we would see them elaborate on places like 1 Corinthians 15 and invent like an independent appearance of James, which is mentioned in there, or the independent appearance of Peter, or add commentary on the appearance of the 500. So the Gospels are not relying on Paul or building a theology or a narrative from just Paul's letters. That would be absurd. But despite that, we see theological agreement between Paul's letters, like in places like 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 7, 1 Thessalonians 2, as well as places like 1 Thessalonians 4, Romans 14. Seun Kim in his chapter goes through passage after passage, and he just notes that the theology we find in Paul is the same theology we were finding in the Gospels. So he argues Paul had access to an early gospel tradition that he was using in his preaching and his teaching. And then this same theology wound up in the Gospels, of course. So there's that. And then you could also make the case that Mark is not dependent on Paul. Maurice Casey and James Crossley have argued that Mark had a source, either written or oral. I think Casey says written, for example. But it was something from one of the members of the 12, which would support the church tradition that Mark was getting his information from Peter. So Mark and Paul are independent sources. They're not really relying on each other, and they're both teaching the same theology. Then, of course, you have other epistles like James, Jude, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, the epistles of John. Then you have the other Gospels as well. The idea that Paul invented all this is just contradicted by so much data that the Muslims do not even consider. They just heard this lie they've been told over and over again by their sheikhs and imams that Paul invented Christianity. But they don't actually look at the evidence. And the evidence shows Paul had early sources he was getting information from. The evidence shows Mark was not relying on Paul, and yet they're teaching the same theology. So the idea Paul invented Christianity is just utter nonsense. The scholarship is not there. Who invented Christianity? Jesus. That'd be the source for Mark, the ultimate source for Paul, the source for Matthew, John, Luke, these guys as well. He's going to be the ultimate source for all of this. So Jesus invented Christianity, regardless of how much some 7th century alleged prophets said that's not true. At the end of the day, who are we going to believe? Some guy in Arabia writing hundreds of years after the fact who didn't know the disciples, who didn't really know what Christians and Jews believed. I mean, he said the Jews claimed Ezra as the son of God, which we know is nonsense. Or are we going to believe people that lived in the 1st century, followed Jesus, and those who followed the apostles? It's pretty clear who's going to give us better information on Jesus. The simplest explanation is Christianity is going to give us a much better explanation in the Christian documents.
Man, I wish Muslims would do better, honestly. Like, this stuff just gets... It's incredible, some of the arguments that they'll believe.
I have never been less convinced of a religion until I dealt with Muslims and their pretty bad arguments, like claiming Muhammad's in the Bible or trying endlessly to say Jesus is a Muslim, which is based on fallacy after fallacy. It's really just, wow. I've never been more convinced that Islam is not true after dealing with their arguments.
I know you and David Wood have been going crazy on the lives that you've been doing on YouTube. So if you haven't checked those out already, make sure to check those out, guys. All right, next one is